And actually now, before we do that whole rigmarole with the clipping and the sewing of the tricky corners, we can actually take a moment to hem our lining. So that's just turning it under twice to the wrong side, so it'll be going up by 1.5 centimeters, which is 5/8 of an inch, and then up another 1.5 or another 5/8 of an inch, and just stitching close to the edge all the way around. And you can press it as you go, you can fold it as you go, as you sew, and that's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to do that now. Right, we've hemmed our lining and we're ready to do the centre back seam of our lining. So we've got our zip notch marked up here, and we're going to be sewing them right sides together. So we're going to have to reach in and grab them right sides together like so, and so we're going to have to pull the garment like that. But I'm just keeping them laid out nicely here so you can visualize what we're going to be doing. So you're going to use that centre back line, sewing at a 2 centimeter seam or 3/4 of an inch. And we're going to have our first pivot point here where we're going to have to clip into our inner curve so these can sew together nicely. And then we've got that diagonal line sewing together along the lining. And then at this dot here, this juncture, we're going to stop and back tack, and that's going to leave a 1 centimeter seam open here and open here, because at this juncture here we're stopping sewing the lining to each other, and we're going to be sewing the lining to each individual side of that kick pleat. So this is where, because we want the lining to flap open. If we joined it all the way down, all of a sudden our kick pleat doesn't kick. So that's going to be our next step. Right, so I've sewn that lining juncture right sides together, and we've got our 1 centimeter from the edge there hanging free. We've got everything turned inside out, and the wrong side, this is the wrong side of the main and this is the wrong side of the lining. They're against each other as they should be. And our next step is going to be turning under this 1 centimeter here and turning under this 1 centimeter here and seaming them right sides together. So you can see how that's going to work there. So I like to work from this side and pinch them together, and then I can open it out and go in there and sew up that vertical seam so they match up there, and they'll match at that juncture. And you're also going to do the other side in the same manner by folding that under, having those edges meet that underlap. So each side is independently seaming to its own side of the kick pleat main. I've sewn those little vertical seams that go attaching the lining to the separate edges of the kick pleat. So the trickiest part is the little juncture up here, because you've got two different seams meeting, and so you can see now it's a little bit tricky with all those darn layers in the way, but you can see now why we had to clip into that inner curve of the lining, because it absolutely has to spread open to be able to sit nicely with that opposing shape. So there's that gap spreading open inside there. And then up here, you can see it's spreading open on the corner there. Can be a little bit confusing turning your brain inside out, but once you get it going, it's looking very good. So what we want to do now is, if I reach inside here, these are free floating. This little diagonal seam on the lining is completely free hanging from this diagonal seam on the main. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach inside and I'm going to find the diagonal line on the main and the diagonal line on the lining, and I'm going to pinch them together. So I'm pinching all of those layers together. So if I pull that out now, you can see that they're all going to sit on top of each other along that diagonal line of the kick pleat, and I'm just going to stitch within the seam allowance to hold them all together along that diagonal line. So just a little line of stitching within that seam. So at this point you're going to want to turn your garment back right side out and make sure everything's sitting nicely, hanging nicely. If your lining somehow has been shortened in this area, it's going to pull on that main and make a bubble along the centre back where it's pulling the main up. So you want to make sure that's not happening. if that were to occur, you could just let out that seam a little bit along here to lengthen that lining along the centre back, let it drop down so it's not straining and pulling the skirt upwards. That shouldn't happen, but it could happen if your errors become multiplied. So that's just a little tip. But once you confirm that's all good, you can finish this little seam here where you're stitching that lining to the zip, and you can just taper that to nothing. Let it graduate in this area by just stopping 1 centimetre away. And that should be all good. And now we get to do the exciting hem on the mane.